Hello and welcome to Byju's IAS. Let's take up the analysis of today's The Hindu newspaper. The central government has reversed its position on the GST compensation shortfall issue. The central government has said that it shall directly borrow the 1.1 lakh crore shortfall in GST compensation from the market and transfer these funds as back-to-back loans to the state governments. See, to understand this article, first we need to briefly understand the background to this topic. Over the last few months, we have been repeatedly covering the GST compensation shortfall issue, which has triggered a dispute between the central government and the state governments. When the goods and services tax was introduced as a unified indirect tax, the central government had committed to the state governments that it shall compensate the state governments for the revenue loss that they are going to incur. Because under the GST, the state governments had agreed to forego a number of state taxes in order to implement the concept of one nation, one tax. So as a result, the state governments were expected to incur a revenue loss, and hence the center had agreed to take up a constitutional obligation to compensate the state governments for their revenue loss. So accordingly, the central government was compensating the state governments every year for their revenue loss. But over the last 1 year, the central government has failed to compensate the state governments because of reduced GST collection, which is a result of the slowdown in the economy. So as a result of this failure of the central government to compensate the states, it currently owes a due of 1.1 lakh crore rupees to the state governments, and this failure of the center to pay the GST compensation to the state governments has started to affect the finances and the fiscal position of a number of state governments. So as a result, the state governments were demanding the center to immediately pay the GST compensation that was due, and they were even threatening to take legal action against the center by approaching the Supreme Court over this issue. So in order to resolve this dispute, a number of meetings of the GST Council took place, because as per constitutional provisions, the GST Council, which is headed by the Union Finance Minister along with finance ministers of all the state governments, has been designated as the apex body to make all decisions related to GST. So accordingly, the GST Council meeting took place, and it was decided between the center and the states that the state government shall be borrowing directly from the market in order to make up for the revenue loss that they would be incurring as a result of the failure of the center to pay them the GST compensation. At the GST Council meet, the center had earlier said that it was not in a position to pay the GST compensation that was due, and hence it had asked the state governments itself to directly borrow from the market to make up for the revenue loss. And in return, the center had promised that the principal amount and the interest that had to be repaid to the lenders by the state governments shall be paid by the center through future GST collections. So essentially, through this proposal, the center was transferring its responsibility to the state governments itself, and it was asking the states to borrow directly from the market in order to make up for the revenue loss. This proposal of the center at the last GST Council meet was accepted by around 21 states and union territories, but several other states such as West Bengal and Kerala, they had opposed this move, and they had even threatened to drag the center to the Supreme Court over the matter. There were two reasons as to why few state governments opposed this proposal of the center. One, by pushing the state governments to borrow from the market to make up for the GST compensation shortfall, the central government was violating its constitutional responsibility towards the state governments. And two, these states felt that they would incur a higher borrowing cost if they were to directly borrow from the market. Because see, when state governments approach the market to make a borrowing, then the lenders would charge them an interest rate based on their respective fiscal position. But unfortunately, most state governments have a weak fiscal position, and hence they would end up paying a higher interest rate. And along with this, each state would be paying a different interest rate based on their respective fiscal deficit position. So this would automatically increase the cost of borrowing for those states in particular which have a higher fiscal deficit. So on these grounds, a few state governments had opposed the center's proposal, and they had threatened to take legal action against the center by approaching the Supreme Court. So now, a few weeks later, the central government has reversed its position, and it has said that the center itself will borrow directly from the market and transfer this amount, that is 1.1 lakh crore, which was due to the state governments as GST compensation, as back-to-back loans to the state governments. This decision of the center has been welcomed by states such as Kerala and West Bengal, and as well as by economic experts. because the center has a much better fiscal position as compared to a number of state governments, and as a result, the cost of borrowing shall be lower. And since the center would be making the borrowing and then transferring the amount as loans to state governments, it can provide for a common interest rate to all the states and union territories instead of making the states pay a differential interest rate if they were to borrow directly from the market. So overall, this decision of the center will lower the cost of borrowing for the state governments, and the Union Finance Ministry has said that this decision won't affect the center's fiscal deficit position or the general government debt. Because this amount which the center is going to borrow from the market won't be reflected on its accounts. Instead, it shall be transferred as loans to the state governments, and it shall be reflected on the accounts of the states as capital receipts received from the center. So this decision will help bring down the borrowing cost for the state governments, and it will provide for a common interest rate for all states and union territories. And it will also help strengthen the finances of the state governments, which has been suffering because of the failure of the center to pay the GST compensation. This will also help prevent any possible center-state legal dispute, which could have easily turned into a constitutional and legal crisis. So that's the reason why the decision of the center has been welcomed by most state governments and as well as by economic experts. Now let's take up a column from page number 6. This column has been written by Shyam Saran, who served as India's Foreign Secretary under Prime Minister Manmohan Singh. In this column, he evaluates the relevance and significance of multilateralism in today's world, which is battling multiple challenges. So first you need to understand what is multilateralism. See, multilateralism basically refers to a combined effort by multiple countries when they are striving towards a common goal or a common target. So institutions such as the United Nations, the World Trade Organization, the Climate Change Convention, etc., they are examples of multilateral institutions. Through such multilateral platforms, countries around the world are working together towards achieving a set of common targets. But of late, multilateralism has taken a hit, mainly because of rising nationalism and conservatism across countries. And this has led many countries to lead unilateral efforts or to form elite clubs or alliances that suits only their nationalistic interests and not global interests. But the challenges that our world is facing today are global in nature, and they can be effectively tackled only through a multilateral effort. This is the very crux of this article. Take for example the COVID-19 pandemic. Such global challenges does not differentiate between geographical boundaries, and it affects all the countries equally without taking the national borders into account. But unfortunately, the rise of nationalism and conservatism in countries around the world that has been promoted by several governments mainly for political reasons has ended up derailing multilateral global efforts, including the development of a vaccine for COVID-19. See, even though the World Health Organization has put together the COVAX alliance to form a global vaccine, many leading powers are largely interested in nationalistic efforts to develop a vaccine on their own, and this has weakened the global vaccine development efforts against COVID-19. Instead, all the countries could have come together and they could have pooled their resources towards a global unified effort, because that is the best way to deal with such global challenges. So in this context, the writer argues that even though we live in a globalized world, and even though there is global integration, there is no solidarity amongst the countries, even on issues such as a pandemic, which is putting human lives at risk. Even if you look at issues such as food security and poverty, there is no unified global effort towards tackling such development challenges, even though they are affecting millions of people around the world. That's why the writer points out that this year's Nobel Peace Prize is a symbolic representation of the relevance and significance of multilateralism. Because this year, the Nobel Committee has awarded the Peace Prize to the World Food Programme. The World Food Programme is a UN organization, and it has led a multilateral effort towards tackling hunger and malnourishment. It is in recognition of this multilateral effort that the Nobel Peace Prize of this year has been awarded to the World Food Programme. But however, data from the UN and the World Food Programme shows that the COVID-19 pandemic is likely to push millions of people around the world into poverty, thereby directly threatening their food security, and it could push millions of people into malnourishment. So in order to tackle these looming humanitarian challenges, what we need is a multilateral effort where all countries come together by keeping aside their differences in order to pool their resources so that they can effectively tackle the global challenges that the world is facing today. But unfortunately, due to the current geopolitical equations, most countries are looking at unilateral efforts and they have taken a stand against multilateralism, and they are seen to be pushing conservative nationalistic agendas primarily to please their domestic political audience. The writer also points out that the United Nations is currently celebrating its 75th anniversary, and it is unfortunate that such a multilateral institution has been sidelined in our efforts against the pandemic. Even though it has been nearly 8 to 9 months since the pandemic broke out, the United Nations has played a very minimal role because the organization is not just outdated, but it has also been sidelined, especially by the powerful members such as the P5, who largely determine the functioning of the UN through their veto at the UN Security Council. Countries such as India have repeatedly pointed out the need for UN reforms, and they have time and again highlighted how the UN has become an outdated organization because it has been subjected to the geopolitics of the P5 countries and other powerful members. That's the reason why over the last 2 decades, India has been making a strong case for UN reforms, through which emerging countries such as India can be given a greater role and responsibility, and only through such global multilateral efforts can we effectively tackle the global challenges that we are facing today. In fact, that's the reason why when Prime Minister Modi addressed the UN a couple of months ago, he made a strong case for renewed multilateralism, and he highlighted the role of multilateral institutions in tackling global challenges. So be it the pandemic, be it poverty, be it food security, or be it the issue of climate change, the need of the hour is for countries to come together under multilateral platforms so that they can pool their resources together and they can jointly combat the global challenges in the larger interest of humanity. But the writer, being a former diplomat, he understands how multilateral negotiations actually work. At any multilateral institution, every diplomat and every country always pushes for maximum returns in return for very little investment. Basically, multilateral negotiations are built on the mantra of giving as little as possible while extracting maximum returns. So when every country and every negotiator is following this mantra, it becomes very difficult to achieve a common ground that can help in tackling the global challenges. But the writer understands why every country takes such an extreme position, because every country is interested in protecting its respective national interests. But however, the writer suggests that it is understandable when countries take such extreme positions on issues of trade and security, because these issues directly affect the national interests of a country. But he says that when it comes to global issues such as climate change and pandemics, we cannot forget that we live in a globalized world, and such global challenges are going to affect every country equally because they simply do not distinguish between national boundaries. See, most governments around the world, they try to create a distinction between domestic issues and external issues. But however, the writer points out that in today's globalized world, this demarcation between domestic and external issues has become increasingly blurred, and domestic issue in a particular country is going to have external consequences that is going to affect most countries around the world. The COVID-19 pandemic is a classic example for this. Similarly, climate change is going to affect each and every country, and such global challenges cannot be treated as internal domestic issues. So in conclusion, if these global challenges have to be tackled effectively, what we need is global solidarity, through which countries can come together by forgetting their nationalistic differences, and they will have to pool their resources together so that they can invest in a combined effort through a multilateral platform for tackling the global challenges of today. Now let's take up another column from page number 6 that has been published on the occasion of World Food Day. See, the United Nations has designated the 16th of October as World Food Day in order to mark the establishment of the Food and Agriculture Organization, which was established on the 16th of October 1945. This column has been written by the representatives of 3 important food-related organizations of the United Nations, which includes the Food and Agriculture Organization, the International Fund for Agriculture Development, and the World Food Programme. So obviously the focus of this column is food security and global hunger. See, under the Sustainable Development Goals of the UN, the second goal is to achieve zero hunger around the world by 2030. So these 3 organizations of the UN are assisting governments around the world to achieve this ambitious target. But the writers of this column point out that the world is not on track to achieve this global target, and all the progress that we had achieved over the years is currently being reversed as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. See, first the writers highlight how important food and nutrition is to ensure a healthy life. Having access to basic food and nutrition is absolutely essential to lead a healthy life and keep ourselves away from a number of diseases. But billions of people around the world lack this basic access to food and nutrition, and as a result, poverty and hunger has become a major developmental challenge. Over the years, even though agricultural productivity has increased significantly around the world, this increase in food security has not eradicated the problem of hunger and malnutrition. Latest data from the UN shows that around 2 billion people around the world lack access to basic food and nutrition, and this makes them highly vulnerable to a variety of diseases, which in turn pushes them into further poverty. So the link between poverty and hunger is basically a vicious cycle. Poverty denies an individual access to basic food and nutrition, and the subsequent malnutrition and diseases pushes the individual further into poverty. So in this context, a global effort is needed with the support of all national governments around the world in order to achieve the ambitious Sustainable Development Goal number 2 of zero hunger by 2030. In this context, the writers evaluate India's performance with regard to food security and hunger, and they praise India for the considerable progress that it has made over the decades. They also appreciate India for the manner in which it has tackled food security and hunger during the COVID-19 pandemic. See, just a few decades ago, India was a net importer of food. Back in the 1960s, India was facing a massive food crisis, and from such a state of dependency, today, India has not only become self-sufficient, but it has also become a net exporter of food grains and other food items. The credit for this should go to the Green Revolution and the subsequent agricultural innovations that India has made, which has significantly boosted India's agricultural productivity. This increase in agricultural productivity has ensured India's food security, and it has helped India to bring down the incidence of hunger and malnutrition. Along with improvements in agriculture and productivity, India has come out with several schemes and policies to ensure the adequate distribution and supply of food, and this has been made possible through the public distribution system and the maintenance of large stocks. So over the decades, India has definitely tackled malnutrition and hunger, and even during the COVID-19 pandemic, the Indian government ensured the additional release of food grains from the buffer stock, which was distributed as emergency assistance to poor families and migrant workers through the PDS system. Despite the lockdown, the Indian government took a number of steps in order to ensure that the lockdown doesn't affect core agricultural activities, and through these steps, it has ensured that agricultural productivity stays up to mark in order to ensure the country's food security. But despite these efforts, and despite this massive reduction in malnutrition, India still faces a massive challenge when it comes to hunger and food security. Because latest government data shows that there are around 40 million children in India who are still malnourished, and more than 50% of the women in the country are anemic. All the progress that India has made over the decades with regard to nutrition of children and women can be credited to programs such as the ICDS or the Integrated Child Development Services and the Midday Meal Program. Through the ICDS program, the government has ensured that cooked food and take-home rations are provided to millions of children and women, especially pregnant women and lactating mothers, in order to ensure their nutritional needs. Similarly, the midday meal programs that are implemented in association with the state governments has not only helped in increasing the retention rate in schools, but it has also taken care of the nutritional needs of school children. But despite this tremendous progress, India still has a massive challenge when it comes to tackling hunger and malnutrition. And as a result of the pandemic, the number of malnourished children and anemic women is just going to increase further in the coming days. Then upon these existing challenges, climate change further threatens food security and hunger, because global warming and climate change can directly threaten agricultural productivity. Extreme weather events such as floods, cyclones, etc., which are a direct outcome of climate change and global warming, they can completely disrupt millions of livelihoods, including that of farmers, and it can threaten agricultural productivity. Any such decline in agricultural productivity will not only push millions of people into poverty, but it will also threaten the country's food security situation, thereby causing more hunger and malnutrition. That's the reason why these UN institutions are advocating national governments around the world to adopt these 3 steps. They are pushing countries to adopt agroecology and sustainable agriculture, which can minimize the impact of agriculture on the climate and as well as make agriculture more climate resilient. Plus, these organizations are pushing governments around the world to stop wastage of food, which is mainly a result of overconsumption and unsustainable practices. So this is where UN organizations like the Food and Agriculture Organization, the International Fund for Agricultural Development, and the World Food Programme are assisting countries like India to strengthen their agricultural and food supply chain in order to make them resilient to these kind of shocks. The shock could be the one induced by climate change or the pandemic, but either ways, the Indian government will have to work towards making its agriculture and food security resilient to these kind of shocks. That's the reason why the writers of this column make a case for the establishment of resilient food systems, which can withstand the impact of these shock events and shield the global agricultural and food supply chains by considering the fact that the world is clearly not on track to achieve the global target of zero hunger by 2030. Now let's take up the practice questions for today. Which of the following are examples of ex situ conservation? Zoological park, national park, wildlife sanctuary, botanical garden. The correct answer is option C, 1 and 4 only. See, ex situ conservation refers to the conservation of threatened species of flora and fauna after they are taken out of their natural habitat and brought into contained environments such as a zoological park or a botanical garden. Whereas the opposite of ex situ conservation is in situ conservation, where the threatened species are conserved and protected within their natural habitat by establishing protected areas such as national parks and wildlife sanctuaries. So they are examples for in situ conservation. This question was asked because of an article on page number 1 which makes a reference to the Nandankanan Zoological Park in Odisha. This zoological park is struggling to feed the animals and maintain the park because of a severe shortage of funds which has been caused as a result of the closure during the COVID-19 pandemic. So in order to raise urgent funds and ensure the well-being of the animals, the zoological park has come up with an animal adoption scheme through which individuals and private organizations and even public organizations can adopt various threatened animals such as the elephant, the Asiatic lion, the Bengal tiger, etc. Now let's take up the next question. In India, the target rating point or TRP for media channels is brought out by the Broadcast Audience Research Council or BARC. Option B is the right answer. This question has been asked because according to this article on page number 1, BARC has suspended TRP ratings of all news channels for a period of 3 months as a result of the ongoing investigation by the Mumbai police into allegations of tampering of TRP ratings by certain news channels. Now let's take up the next question. A commercial ship that has ran aground poses which of the following threats to the marine environment? Oil spill, leakage of toxic chemicals, greenhouse gas emissions, damage to coral reefs. The correct answer would be option D, 1, 2 and 4 only. Because see, when a ship runs aground, there is a possibility of an oil spill, there is a possibility of leakage of toxic chemicals, and it could even damage the coral reefs. This question has been asked because according to this article on page number 8, a Bangladeshi ship has run aground near Visakhapatnam, thereby raising concerns over the possibility of an oil spill and other environmental threats. Now let's take up the next question. Which of the following statements are correct? The Eat Right India movement was launched by the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare. The movement aims to cut down salt, sugar and oil consumption by 30% in 3 years. This movement is aligned with the government's flagship public healthcare programs such as Poshan Abhiyan, Anemia Mukt Bharat, Ayushman Bharat Yojana and Swachh Bharat Mission, and as well as the Fit India movement. Under the movement, the government has prescribed a limit for TPCs or total polar compounds at 25% in cooking oil to avoid the harmful effects of reused cooking oil. Amongst the given statements, the first statement is incorrect, so option D is the right answer. Because see, the Eat Right India movement was launched by the Food Safety and Standards Authority of India and not by the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare. All the other 3 statements are correct, so option D is the right answer. This question has been asked because in this article on page number 10, the Union Health Minister has made a reference to the Eat Right India movement and as well as the Fit India movement. Now let's take up the next question. The Taiwan Strait is also known as the Formosa Strait. Option A is the right answer. Please look at this map. This is where the Taiwan Strait is located. It is located between the self-governing island of Taiwan and mainland China. The Taiwan Strait connects the South China Sea with the East China Sea in the Pacific Ocean, and it is a highly contentious region as a result of the ongoing maritime disputes in the South China Sea. This geographical location is in news because we have an article on page number 13 which makes a reference to the entry of a US warship, that is a US naval ship, into the Taiwan Strait. And since the question of Taiwan's sovereignty is a source of tension between US and China, China has objected to the entry of the US naval ship into the Taiwan Strait. Now let's take up the next question. Houthi rebels are involved in a civil war in which country? The correct answer is option C, Yemen. This question has been asked because we have an article on page number 13 that makes a reference to Yemen's civil war and the Houthi rebels. See, over the last 6 years, Yemen has descended into a civil war, and the Yemeni government has been fighting this conflict against the Houthi rebels. Reportedly, the Houthi rebels are sponsored by Iran as a part of its covert proxy war against Saudi Arabia, which backs the Yemeni government. In 2018, a peace deal was brokered by the United Nations in Sweden to bring the civil war to an end, and as per the terms of this deal, a prisoner exchange was agreed, and accordingly, the Yemeni government and the Houthi rebels have begun the prisoner exchange process. Now let's take up the next question. Which of the following statements are correct? India has acceded to the Hong Kong Convention for Ship Recycling under the International Maritime Organization. Accordingly, the central government has notified the Director General of Shipping as the National Authority for Recycling of Ships under the Recycling of Ships Act of 2019. IMO adopted the Hong Kong International Convention for the Safe and Environmentally Sound Recycling of Ships in 2009, and its guidelines are aimed at ensuring that ship recycling does not pose any unnecessary risks to human health, safety and the environment. All the three statements are correct, so option C is the right answer. See, India recently acceded to the Hong Kong Convention that deals with environment-friendly ship recycling. And in accordance with the obligations of this convention of the IMO, yesterday the Indian government has notified the Director General of Shipping as the National Authority for Recycling of Ships. This authority is expected to come up at Gandhinagar in Gujarat, and it is expected to monitor the compliance of the ship recycling industry to environment-friendly norms and safety and health standards. Now let's take up a practice question from this year's prelims paper. With reference to blockchain technology, consider the following statements. It is a public ledger that everyone can inspect, which no single user controls. This is a correct statement. It is a decentralized public ledger which is not controlled by any single entity. The structure and design of blockchain is such that all the data in it are about cryptocurrency only. This statement is incorrect because blockchain technology doesn't deal with cryptocurrency alone. It can be used to build several other applications as well. Cryptocurrency or digital currency is just one of the applications of blockchain technology. The third statement says that applications that depend on the basic features of blockchain can be developed without anybody's permission. This is again a correct statement. Any user can build any application by using the foundation of blockchain technology. So the correct answer would be option D, 1 and 3 only. Finally, let's take up a couple of mains practice questions. The first question, discuss how multilateralism is relevant in today's world. The second question, resilient food systems will have to be built back as the world is not on track to achieve the Sustainable Development Goal target of zero hunger by 2030. Evaluate. So kindly write an answer to these questions and post your answers in the comment section below. This concludes our discussion for the day. Thanks for watching.